Hey everybody, Tim Ulbrich here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, Tim Baker and I wrap up our two-part series on 10 common retirement risks to plan for. Now, in planning for retirement, so much attention is given to the accumulation phase, but what doesn't give a lot of press is how to turn those assets into a retirement paycheck for an unknown period of time. When building a plan to deploy your assets during retirement, it's important to consider various risks to either mitigate or avoid altogether. And that's what we're discussing during this two-part series, where today we cover the 5 remaining retirement risks, including frailty risk, financial elder abuse risk, investment risk, work risk, and family risk. Make sure to download our free guide that accompanies this two-part series, Retirement Roadblocks, Identifying and Managing 10 Common Risks. You can download that at yourfinancialpharmacist.com/retirement risks. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/retirement risks. Before we jump into my conversation with Tim Baker, let's hear a brief message from YFP team member Justin Woods.
This is Justin Woods from the YFP team with a quick message before the show. If you listen to the YFP podcast, you may learn something every now and then, either from Tim Ulbrich, Tim Baker, or one of our guests. A lot of people listen to the show, but they may not execute or implement the things they learn. As pharmacists, we know the impact of non-adherence on patient outcomes and their overall well-being. As a pharmacist myself and part of the YFP team, I talk with pharmacists every day who are confused about how to implement financial knowledge. Pharmacists share with me that they're treading water financially, maybe took a DIY approach, reached a plateau, and are confused about what to do next. Or those who worked for decades can see the light at the end of the tunnel and feel uncertain about how the next chapter will unfold. If that sounds like you, 1, it is not uncommon to feel that way. And 2, does it make sense for us to have a conversation to see if YFP planning can help you? Visit yfpplanning.com or follow the link in the show notes to find a time that works for your schedule.
Tim Baker, welcome back.
Good to be back, Tim. How's it going?
It is going well. Last week, we started this two-part series on 10 common retirement risks to be planning for. We talked about things like longevity risk. We talked about inflation risk. We talked about excess withdrawal risks. Listeners can tune back to that episode. We'll link to that in the show notes if they didn't already listen. And we're going to continue on. So number 6 on our list of 10 common retirement risks to plan for. Number 6 is frailty risk. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, so this is more related to, it's a risk that as a result of either mental or physical deterioration of your health, mental health, physical health, that you as a retiree might not be able to have sound judgment in managing your financial affairs or care for your home. Those are the two big ones. So just like we talked about in the last episode, that like with the long-term care and long-term care risk, this is one that people are like, oh yeah, this is important, but it's not going to happen to me. And, what studies have shown is that, the longer that you're retired, the more your mental health decreases over time. Mm-hmm. So this is going to be, where, we really want a good support system. So a solution here is, if we work longer, obviously our mental acuity, our mental sharpness kind of stays intact longer. We're not as isolated. There's lots of studies about depression and loneliness, Tim, creep in, and a lot of things that have not really been talked about as regarding retirement in the past. And I think a lot of this points back to some of the frailty risk. So, having a good network, involving your family to have help, whether it's with decision making or chores, hiring someone to help manage the money, or a trustee is another good solution here. Set up a power of attorney for, the financial situation. It could even be, things like healthcare. Probably a big thing that I often hear is having a good discussion and analysis of like the living situation.
Yes.
Right. So a lot of people as they age, they might not necessarily want to move out of the house where they raised their family. A house that might be 3, 4, 5 bedrooms that has a big yard, lots of yard work, lots of housework, maybe stairs to go up and down. And because of the kind of the emotional attachment to the house, it's just hard for the retiree to move on and potentially downsize or move into a townhome or a condo or a community that is different. But that's probably what has one of the biggest effects on the frailty risk. If you're less likely, I think, if to kind of be exposed to this risk if you have, again, more people around you that are dealing with the same thing. We mentioned a trust, so potentially putting assets in a live-in trust that are basically managed by the trustee, which could be you, the retiree, and then you could have a successor trustee, which could be a family member or family members. But the whole thing, I think, is to kind of plan for this. We want to make sure that we don't necessarily have to go through the courts, that we can kind of do this preemptive, even simplifying the finances. So things like direct deposit, automatic withdrawal for bills, annuities, checks coming in the door, rather than, having to make decisions regarding, okay, how much should I withdraw this year? These are all things that I think would help, simplify and make this risk not avoidable, but mitigate it, Tim.
Yeah. And as we wrapped up, the previous episode, part 1, talking about the importance of planning for this early, right? So here we're talking about potentially deteriorating mental or physical health. Obviously, if and when that happens, I guess it's just a matter of time, right, for all of us. But if and when that happens, we don't want to be making these decisions in that moment, right? So how can we be having these conversations in advance? You talked about an important one that often comes up around housing. What's the desire? I'm thinking about things like legacy folders and making sure we've got good systems and documentations in place. And I think the housing one comes up so often. I'm thinking about even my own family. Like sometimes it's just hard to cut through the noise on this because you gave one example where people may want to stay in their own home. I think that's a common one. The other one that I see as well is where people are adamant on like, hey, I don't want to be a burden on the family. So just put me in a facility. It's hard sometimes to cut through the noise of like, what is the true desire and how's that being projected? And, maybe there's an interest and a willingness and the financial means for children, to be able to care for their elderly parents. And that's a desire, for them to do. But you can't get through some of those conversations. So just again, I think in a point of advocacy for talking through as much of this as possible, as early as possible. And for those that are listening where, maybe they have adult children that are going to be important caregivers, initiating that conversation with your adult children, and those that are the children that have aging parents, initiating those conversations as well.
Absolutely.
Tim, number 7, one that's not fun to talk about, one that we have to, just given, the reality of what it may be, which is financial elder abuse risk.
Yeah, and this is the risk of being taken advantage of because of frailty. So these are kind of linked, Tim. And I saw a stat out there that this can cost anywhere from like $3 to $36 billion a year or something like that. It's insane. And probably the biggest culprits of this is like people that the retiree knows and knows well. So that could be an advisor, financial advisor. It could be a family member. So adult children are probably the biggest abusers of this. But 55% of these cases are family members, friends, neighbors, or caregivers. And the crime or the abuse could be anywhere from bad advice to fraud, borrowing against the person's home, theft, which could either be, cash, taking money out of accounts, using credit cards, embezzlement, misuse of power of attorneys. And unfortunately, and I think it's why it's so hard to kind of like put a number to this in terms of like what the losses are, is that the abuse often goes unnoticed because, that retiree could be embarrassed. They really don't want to punish those that are close to them, or they have fear of losing care that is being provided, even though they're being abused, or even reprisals. And it's one of the things that, we're, as an advisor, even though we're on that list of abusers, that we're kind of trained to look for and ask questions in terms of like, okay, is there something going on? What is the cognitive ability of this person? Are they making sound judgment? Who in the family is involved, that type of thing. And, there's been, I've heard of cases where it's like Mr. Jones is having $50,000 of work, done to his kitchen at 85 years old, and that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but it could be a contractor that's kind of take advantage. And sometimes Mr. Jones, it's a little bit of it's being taken advantage of, but it also could be like they like the company, So I think a major solution for this, I would say, is involve trusted family members, and I underline trusted, and I underline the S in members. So a little bit of checks and balances. If you have two siblings that are kind of looking after, hopefully they're not both, criminally minded, but I think it's good to have a few people that are, overwatching, so to speak, the situation. And I think as much as the person, the retiree, can protect themselves by staying organized, tracking possession, tracking their assets, as much as they can, open their own mail, sign their own checks, manage their investment, manage their statements, their investment accounts, their bank accounts, have set up direct deposit as much as they can for Social Security checks or annuity payments, that can, again, help not necessarily avoid, but mitigate some of the exposure to this risk, screen calls, solicitations, get second opinions on, we come across things even with clients where like, is this legit? Like clients that are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and sometimes they're like, it's not. So, get a second opinion and make sure that we're kind of hyper aware, because this is it's a big problem, unfortunately. And it's tough to kind of diagnose and see and at every angle, from because often the person that's being abused is like, for what I mentioned, is not necessarily willing to kind of come forward with this.
Tim, I have to bring it up since you mentioned siblings. I think this is an area where there's so many dynamics, right? Every family's different, but I think that when you're dealing with assets and estates, and obviously one at the end of the day is going to get assigned as a power of attorney, and people that are in or not in the will, and whether those conversations are transparent or not. I feel like any sibling dynamics, you can just put a magnifying glass on them here. So, Cameron Huddleston, we referenced in the previous episode, and we had her on a few episodes ago about initiating some of these financial conversations with your parents, talks about the importance of sibling conversations in unity, ideally, easier said than done, to then be able to obviously translate that with parents as well.
Yep, absolutely.
Tim, number 8, investment risk. We talked about this briefly in the first part of this 2-part series, but I think it warrants going a little bit deeper.
Yeah. So investment risk, I'm kind of going to break this down into kind of sub risks to this. So what I really want to kind of address here is market risk, interest rate risk related to the investments, liquidity risk, and then kind of come back to the sequence of return risk. So if I take these in turn, market risk is really the risk of financial loss resulting from movements in market prices. So unfortunately, Tim, the market just doesn't kind of increase steadily as we go. We have lots of, ups and downs and twists and turns with regard to the market, which often makes us kind of queasy and I would say even more, like, I feel like for me, when I first started to invest, back, in my 20s, I would kind of feel those investments, and I've kind of got to a point where I just get zen and I try to like not pay attention to it, because again, it's not going to affect me until hopefully 30 years in the future when I do retire.
Should do some market meditations, right? Like,
exactly. So, but for a retiree who, like their paycheck and their livelihood is kind of tied to the market, I could see how that could be overwhelming and distracting. So, a solution here is, I think, really strive for balance and flexibility. So we kind of mentioned in the past, like a flooring strategy. So you mitigate market risk when a lot of your paycheck is not coming or not tied to the market. So that's where we, are essentially, we're looking at essential expenses, and we're saying, hey, my essential expenses or my basic needs are covered with an annuity or Social Security or very low risk, government securities like treasury bonds, treasury bonds, notes, that type of thing, and we're good. The other part of that is allocation. So obviously a lower percent of your portfolio in equity, particularly leading up to retirement, is going to be important to kind of mitigate market risk. So even in some of the, the .com crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis, the COVID crisis, like the market's still doing this. But if you have less equity exposure, it might not be Rocky Mountains ups and downs. It might be Appalachian Mountains up and downs where it's a little bit smoother. But I think knowing, what your allocation and what your glide path is as you approach retirement is going to be important. And then, finally, I think for this particular risk is kind of go back to flexibility. So if you're in if you're in a year where the market is down and maybe inflation is up, inflation is up, like maybe we say, okay, we're not going to take that $15,000 out to go travel, do this huge cruise or make this, we're going to forego that and see when the market kind of recovers, and then we'll kind of assess it from there. So flexibility of like what you're withdrawing and when, I think is going to be important with regard to market risk. The other one's, Tim, interest rate risk. So this is related to investment risk. So this is the risk of the change in value of an asset as a result of volatility in interest rates. So what does this mean? This essentially means that when interest rates go up, as they have been over the last couple of years, the price of bonds go down. So there's an inverse relationship. So the price of individual bonds and bond mutual funds decreases. So when interest rates go down, the price of bonds go up. So this is not necessarily a concern when bonds are held to maturity, or when I was mentioning in the last episode, a bond ladder. So if I buy a year a bond or 6-month bond that basically comes up at the end of the next or at the end of this year, or a year, 18 months, or whatever that looks like, if it holds to maturity, the fluctuation in interest rates do not affect the bond price. So you're kind of inoculated from that. It's when you kind of are coming in and out of bonds, that's where it becomes problematic. The other risk associated with this is, and I've seen this, so one of the things that because I'm a nerd, but one of the things I do with my emergency fund is I buy 12-month CDs every quarter. So I have a quarter one CD. So let's pretend I have $20,000 in my emergency fund. 10,000 might be in a high yield savings account. 10,000 might be split up between four CDs, and you can kind of think of these as like bonds. So Q1, I have 2,500. January 1, Q2, April 1, so on and so forth. So as prices, as interest rates have gone up, if I look back 12 months ago, man, I look at that interest rate, I'm like, man, that's really low. So when I renew, Tim, the what I'm getting in terms of interest is a lot higher. But the opposite can true, and this is what's called reinvestment risk. I could have this bond that I just bought at 5%, or the CD or bond that I just bought at 5%, but in a year or 2 years, it could be at 3%. And then that's the reinvestment risk. So that's another risk that we have to, kind of be aware of. So I think the biggest thing here is, again, things that are inflation protected. So any type of income stream or investment that has inflationary protection, like tips or strips, any type of COLA protection, that's going to really what's going to be to help reduce that risk. And then finally, the third one is liquidity risk. So this is just basically the inability to have assets available to financially support unanticipated cash flow needs. I don't think that this is a risk that's really inherent just to retirement. We all have this in all times. It might be a little bit harder to overcome because we don't necessarily have cash flow from like a set job. But planning for this, kind of plan as best you can for what could happen. So what are the situations, and then what levers can we pull? What are the assets that can be sold? What are things that can't be sold? Which, assets that can be sold could be things like stocks and bonds and things like that. Maybe not so easily. Could be a business interest or real estate. What are some other things that we can talk about to pull, whether that's life insurance, a HELOC, a reverse mortgage. And then one of the best reasons to employ a systemic withdrawal strategy is because of the flexibility, because you have this pot of money that you can reach into and say, okay, I didn't think I needed $30,000 for X, but now because that money is there and I can put it into a liquid form and pour it, then, that's one of the things versus if you were to say, hey, I'm going to put all of my money into an annuity, that's not flexible and that's not liquid. So it allows you to change your strategy in the face of, new information, new situations. And finally, the last one here, and again, Tim, we could probably do a whole episode on sequence of return risk, is the risk that the timing of your withdrawals from a retirement account will damage your overall in return and really like sustainability. So when you withdraw from a bear market or when the market is down, it's more costly than if you make that same exact withdrawal in a bull market. So what we're saying is that a large negative return during retirement. So during that risk zone, that eye of the storm of, 10 years before retirement, 10 years after retirement, has a much bigger impact on wealth accumulation and success in retirement than a negative return outside of that. So that's why I'm saying that at 40, I get zen because I'm like, it doesn't really affect me if the market goes down 40%, because I know I have 30 years for it to recover, and it's going to go down 40% a couple times probably over the next 30 years. But if I'm retiring in 5 years, I'm worried, Tim. And again, like that's where we have to be as safe as we can, throughout our wealth accumulation journey, is right in that zone, 5 to 10 years before and 5 to 10 years after. And this is when your retirement accounts are most vulnerable to investment returns. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because this is typically, Tim, where you have the highest balance. So wealth rises rapidly as you approach your retirement date, due to the fact that you're putting in probably the most in contributions you ever have, because a lot of people are like, oh, I didn't do enough of this. I need to make up. I got to catch up because of investment returns and compounding. So that's when you're, and the research says that in a defined contribution plan, say like a 401k, this is interesting. You accumulate half the value of the account in the final 10 years of savings. So we say save early and often, but what moves the needle the most is in the last 10 years. In the early years of savings, additional contributions can replenish account losses, but later the contributions are a much, much smaller needle mover than it is like investment losses or gains.
Yeah, and Tim, just I was just thinking about this because I think it's harder, especially if folks are earlier in their career, to understand kind of the numbers of this. If you're nearing retirement and you have a $3 million portfolio, as you mentioned, one part that's going to keep driving that up is typically you're maybe feeling like you got to play catch up, or you've got more discretionary income at that phase, so you're hyper saving, trying to max out accounts. But even if we just look at that $3 million portfolio and assume something like a 5% return in that year, $150,000 of growth that's going to happen in that portfolio in that year, right? And people that are early saving, the timeline to get to 150 can feel like forever. And here we're talking about 150 of growth in a portfolio just in that single year. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah, and if you compare that to what you can legally contribute, that's the big thing. Whereas now you're like, oh, 20,500, that's like that might be a third of my savings. So it's huge. So the really, what the research shows that the magnitude of the impact of a large negative investment return or shock grew as the shock occurred closer to retirement.
Yeah, makes sense.
So it's like if the epicenter of that shock is close to age 65 when you retire, the consequences are greater than if it were at 58, which makes sense. So for sequence risk, the order of returns becomes a far more important concern in that span of time over the breadth of the entire portfolio, particularly in the accumulation. It's the average return that matters, right? So one of the things that I often say is like, hey, like you don't need a lot of bonds in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and I would even say in your 50s, unless you're retiring, in your 50s. You don't need a ton of bonds. So like you want to almost have like a cliff where you're very much like pedal to the metal, you're primarily in equities. And then when you get to that 10-year, that's when you start downshifting considerably. So like a hard break versus what a lot of people do is they kind of glide into it. So in their 40s, they put a little bit more bonds. In their 50s, they'll put a little bit more bonds, and so on. And I just think that and I understand why, you're kind of easing into it, but I just think that you leave a lot of you leave a lot of meat on the bone with regard to investment returns. But the same is true is like you kind of have to get into that period of 10 to 15 or 10 years pre and post retirement date, and then start adding equities back in, which a lot of people don't do. So the solution for this is asset allocation, and whether you follow a glide path or not in terms of, percentage of equities to bonds, knowing what that is. We often see in the accumulation phase, I think, not the proper asset allocation, so too heavily in bonds, and then closer to retirement, actually too heavily in equities. So if you have one of those shocks where the market is down, that's when we have to have real conversations of like, hey, maybe we need to push out retirement until the market, the market corrects. Again, flexibility, allow for changes in what is withdrawn. So if the down market, either decrease the amount that we're withdrawing, or actually the entire equation where, we're not retiring this year or next year, we're retiring when the market recovers. And then another solution is to kind of get out of the game or at least partially convert a portion of the portfolio to an income annuity, which essentially, means less overall volatility because you have that income floor in place.
Yeah, Tim, great overview of the investment risk. To your point, we probably can and should, cover this in more detail in future episodes. And I think flexibility keeps coming back as a theme. But I want to acknowledge how hard that can be, right? When you talk about something like, hey, maybe shifting your retirement date makes a whole lot of sense objectively, right? If I have planned a retirement age, I'm listening of, 2026, and we see the market tank in 2025, like I've been mentally preparing for retirement in 2026. That's a hard, thing to consider, but I think that open-mindedness and the options to be able to pursue some of those things that gives you more of that flexibility to maximize your portfolio is going to be really important. The other thing I just want to mention that we see a lot, because especially folks that are maybe introductory in terms of investing or learning, or, aren't working a planner. I'm thinking about a lot of folks that are invested heavily in target date funds, where we maybe see some of that conservative investing happening too early, in my opinion, in the portfolio.
Yep. Yeah. And just to go back to what I completely agree and again, not every target date fund is created equal.
That's right.
When you actually, when I actually crack those target date funds open and you can see the allocation, something that might be a 20-35, if you stack up a 20-35 or a 20-55, target date fund, what is in target date fund A is going to be, 20-35 is going to be a lot different than what's in a target date fund B that's in, 20-35. But to go back to the other point, and we're going to get into this in the next couple of risks here. Sometimes like you've mentally said, all right, like I'm going to work for another 2 years. Sometimes that decision is made for you. And that could be hard. So then like, what do you do? So I think a lot of these risks is like, if you can kind of maintain as much control over your destiny. And I think part of this is having options, particularly with things related to work. It allows you to kind of pivot and adjust and kind of parry some of the, some of these things that are thrown at you. Like when because I keep saying, I want to retire at age 70. I want to, and I mentioned earlier in the first episode of this, it's like that might be out of my control. And, that's something else we have to account for.
Yeah. If Mike Tyson were listening, he'd say, right, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Yep. So, yeah.
Exactly.
So let's talk about that. Work risk is number 9 on our list. What is that?
So again, I'm going to break these down into some sub-risks. So the first one would be forced retirement risk. So this is the risk that work will end prematurely because of poor health, disability, job loss, or to care for a family member because of some of these issues. And this is an eye-opening stat, Tim. It's 40% of retirees retire earlier than they plan. And it's really because of one of those issues: health, job loss, caring for a family member. This happened to my dad. My dad, tell the story, when we kind of talk about this, his company was bought by another company. He was kind of duplicitous, kind of at the tail end of his career, and he was laid off. So if he was planning to retire by X and his portfolio and all, like you had to kind of, reconfigure, jostle things around and make sure that, we're planning accordingly. So I think having like a pulse on kind of your retirement readiness at different ages. So, okay, what happens to my plan if I have to retire 10 years before I want to, or So for me, it would be 60 or at 65. Like what
scenario
happens?
1,
like
2, 3.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And, what happens to like my lifestyle, what do I have to, are there things other levers that I can pull? So one of those I think is career. So I think staying current, learning new skills, I think Tim, like we're naturally like this, is like lifetime learners and always trying to, self-improve. That's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think maintaining your network. I don't know the last time I actually put my resume together, Tim, but like I think that would be something that you would want to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot easier to kind of brush that up every year or so versus, kind of cracking that open every decade.
Mm-hmm.
Is there opportunities to pivot to consultant, to kind of work on your own? I think a lot of people paying attention to severance policies and negotiating benefits, related to, your careers is going to be important. Another thing to kind of, mitigate the health stuff is, maintaining a healthy lifestyle. So, diet, weight, sleep, exercise, and potentially like reducing stress by cutting back hours. So we kind of mentioned like a glide path of going from a 1 to a 0.8 to a 0.6, to working a couple hours here and there. So I think like that can potentially allow you to work part-time longer into retirement by maintaining a healthy lifestyle, maybe meditation, all that kind of stuff. The second work risk we'll talk about is reemployment risk. So this is the inability to supplement retirement income with employment due to kind of down job markets, poor health, or if you're, caring for others. So I think for my dad, when it happened to him, I think it was hard for him because he had worked for the same company for 40 plus years to actually go into the market and interview and do something else. Mm-hmm. So for him, it was kind of more about like comfortability and, and he didn't really have anything else outside of that where he could consult or do part-time. Like I've heard people like drive a bus for a school and like in that, cause they're connected to kids or, turning, hobbies into profit making activities. I was talking with my brother and his fiance last night because we were actually talking about, hey, when do you want to retire and when is that? One of the things that he brought up that I thought was interesting. He's like, I think I'd love to do like an air or like a bed and breakfast. I'm like, that's cool. Like, he likes to cook. He likes to host. So I think that would be something that would be good for him.
Yeah.
Planning on earning significant income in retirement may be unrealistic for a lot of people. There are certain industries where it's very easily, you can very easily kind of pivot to a consultant role and make just as much money as you would, working full time, but that's not necessarily the case for a lot of people. So I think kind of, again, planning for this, talking through this and understanding, what are some things that you can potentially lean on or pivot to in the event that, what you thought was a sure thing, which was like your employment is not so much. And again, I think this often is one of those things where it's like, hey, that's not going to happen to me.
Yeah.
And I think this has probably evolved over time, right, Tim? Because like, again, like it's rare where you find someone like my dad that's worked for the same company for 40 or 45 years. So I think our eyes are a little bit more open to this risk. But I think what maybe might not be is the fact that like, hey, like your health or someone close to you or something like that could affect your timeline, so to speak, for retirement.
Yeah. And as you're talking, Tim, I'm thinking about many people in our community, of which many of them have been on the podcast, where, I think they may intentionally or unintentionally are preparing themselves for something like this and the risks that you're talking about, right? They've got, maybe they're investing in real estate in a variety of ways. They're working a full-time job. They're doing some consulting. They've got a side hustle. They maintain an active network. They're constantly developing their skills, right? Just multiple strategies of diversification that I think help mitigate against some of the risks that you're talking. And maybe they're not even thinking about it in that way. It's coming from an area of energy and passion, but can be really helpful as we talk about strategies to plan for this type of risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Number 10 on our list is family risks. Take us home, Tim.
Yeah. So the two kind of sub risks that we would talk here is kind of the loss of spouse risk and then unexpected family financial responsibility risk. So the loss of spouse essentially is where, I'll use myself. I retire at 70. I think I'm going to live at least to 87 or 95, and I pass away unexpectedly at 72.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the problem often with that is, you're often, for many spouses, you're counting on two Social Security, income streams.
Right.
So one of those goes away. You keep the highest one, but the problem, so you still have all of the assets. The spouse will inherit all the assets that are, in their name, obviously. But what typically doesn't reduce is a lot of like living expenses, right? Mm-hmm. So your food might go down, but like you're still going to have to pay if you have a mortgage, property or taxes, a rent or things like that. Mm-hmm. Tax, all of those utilities are going to be very similar. So just because your income or a good chunk of your income could be cut in half or even a third, your expenses don't. So, and what we've seen, at least with baby boomers, is that you could be a widow or a widower for 15 or 20 years. So it's not like, one, and this does happen where one spouse dies and the one, will die within a year or two. I mean, but so that does happen, but you could have long periods of time where you're by yourself. There was a stat that I saw that was really interesting, Tim, was within 5 years of a death of a spouse, 40% of widows become impoverished.
Wow.
That's insane to me. And I think if I had to guess, I don't know this, Tim, but if I had to guess, I would think that that's probably, again, people that are lower income that might, like, a huge chunk of their livelihood is in disability. So if a good chunk of or not disability, is Social Security. So if a good chunk of that goes away, so you have two paychecks is down one, mm-hmm. That could be very problematic for kind of sustainability of the overall wealth. But that to me was eye-opening. And I've heard that before with husbands will say, like, I just want to make sure my wife is taken care of, like, if I'm gone. And then again, like, I don't want to get into much of like gender roles and things like that. But I still think that exists in a lot of relationships, particularly older couples where, one partner, handles the money and the other one doesn't, or has an interest and the other one doesn't. So, I think the solution for this is, and I've talked to people, in the past, it's like, I want a relationship with like an advisor where I trust them, because even when I'm gone, they're going to take care of, the person, my spouse. So I think like having a relationship with that, with like a planner, I think can be important. I think involvement, I often say this with couples of all ages, the more that you are involved with your plan, and the more you are engaged with the plan, like both of you, I think the better the results will be. But I also understand that there's some there's some couples that there might be engagement in the front end, and then maybe one spouse kind of, drives the train after that. But then often what happens is, like, again, if that spouse dies, like, they kind of have to re-engage, which isn't necessarily like the easiest thing. So, what are the contingency plans if this were to happen? Even, sometimes like if we were to say, hey, Tim, we're going to peel off $250,000 of your portfolio to provide an income floor for you and Jess. What's attractive about those payoff schedules is like the one that just pays you your lifetime is the highest, but we would want to say, okay, like, let's have a joint life payout. So it would pay you as long as one of you are alive, but that benefit's going to be lower. Yeah. But so decisions like that, if you have like second to die policies, or, again, Social Security claim, and there's a lot of people that, they don't look at the layers of that decision that says, okay, even if Tim is in poorer health than Shay, if I have a larger benefit that I want to defer, that I should defer, that benefit grows. And then when I pass away, Shay takes that on. So some of those nuances aren't necessarily, evaluated. So those would all be things that, again, it's not just the abrupt, okay, the husband is gone or the wife is gone. These are things that we have to bake into the plan as we go, because, things like Social Security or, payouts and things like that have to be decided. So it's not just the abrupt, okay, what happens once that happened in that moment? It's the multitude of the decisions that you have to make potentially leading up to that. And then lastly, it's the unexpected financial responsibility risk. So this is kind of the risk of failure to launch, Tim. Like, hey, I'm 40 years old. I just lost my job, or I'm divorced. I'm moving back in, mom and dad, or, care of a grandchild, or, because parents are, have problems with the law or drug addiction. Like these things happen, and sometimes we can kind of put this into like maybe a liquidity risk of like unanticipated events. But I would say like those would be things that, I would want as a planner to know, like, is there a possibility for this? And if this were to happen, what do we do?
Yeah.
So that's another, risk associated with family. Families can be great, obviously, but sometimes, that's kind of my biggest fear is like, I want to make sure that as I'm, raising my kids, and I know it's the same is true with you, Tim, like they can be contributing members of society that can, be self-sustaining, but sometimes that's even out of their hands. Right. So
that's the hope.
we want to make sure that, in the event that happens, we can plan accordingly.
Tim, as you talk about loss of spouse, a couple things are coming up for me. One that's timely, where Jess and I are working on just updating our legacy folder that we created several years back, but in our planning with Kelly from our team, it's a part of the process that we need to go back to and update it. And, to your comment about the importance of joint planning and all parties being involved, ideally, even in this situation where Jess and I feel like are both very well informed, I do take a little bit more of the lead, but it's very much a shared, agenda and execution. And both of us engage with Kelly in the planning, instructions on that legacy folder, while they're spelled out as much as possible, for either one of us, or in the event that both of us were to pass away, for our parents or whoever would be taking care of, the finances and the boys, it's go call Kelly, like someone we trust that knows this plan inside out, that has these documents, that understands all the nuances and what is going on. And that is so reassuring. Again, assumption is you have someone you trust. So reassuring to know you've got a third party that not only is there to help you develop the plan, but is there in the event of, some of these challenging situations that may come up, to make sure that we're executing how we wanted it to be executed.
Yeah, and I think what's not covered in that, like I love the idea of like, okay, Kelly's a safe haven, like she has the documents, she knows her situation. I think it's hugely, hugely important. But I think what's also not necessarily discussed in this is kind of like the emotional or like social, my parents are in town this week and last week and this week. It's been cool because, my brother's been in town too. So the three of us been spending, my dad just turned 77.
Baker powwow.
Yeah. And, we're joking with my dad that like if my mom passed away, like, I don't think my dad knows how to do like a load of laundry. Like, love you, Dad. But like, he's very much dependent on like my mom over, decades and decades of marriage. Like, if something were to happen to him, like, I think he would have to move in with one of us to like live. And I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about their parents and they're like that's my dad or that's my mom. So like, and, I think even that of the loss of spouse, not just from a financial standpoint or like where are the documents or things like that. It's kind of the day-to-day, living in terms of like, what am I doing, or what can I do, or what can I not do? And who am I leaning on? And, I think that kids are probably the first people that are in that role. But I think like having those conversations, before that happens, where, maybe there's less emotion and, involved, is smart. So it's not just a numbers, it's what's the quality of life? Like, what are the things that we're going to do to move forward? And unfortunately it is part of life. And I think the more that you can kind of get in front of things, just like anything else, I think the better result you'll have.
Yeah. The other thing to your point about the emotional journey that's coming up is throwback almost 4 years ago now, but we had on episode 127, we had on Michelle Cooper, who wrote the book, I Still Got Me, A Widow's Journey to Love, Happiness, and Financial Independence, lost her husband to suicide, and talks about not only the importance of joint planning and shared understanding of processes and documentation, but also navigating that in the midst of that emotional loss. Great interview, great resources. We'll link to that in the show notes as well. Tim, this has been fantastic, as we've covered in 2 episodes now, 10 of these risks that we need to be planning for and mitigating the best that we can. For folks that are listening, you heard a theme here of early planning. Obviously, we would love to have the opportunity to talk with you if you're interested in working more with one-on-one with a financial planner that you can trust. We've got a team of fee-only certified financial planners, tax professionals that work with pharmacists, households all across the country at all stages of their career. You can learn more by going to yfpplanning.com, and you can book a free discovery call from that site. Again, yfpplanning.com. Tim Baker, as always, great stuff. Thanks for the contribution.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.